I now call upon Professor Romila Thappar to deliver her lecture.
I was saying that I'd like to start off by expressing my deep appreciation, my grateful thanks for the honor that has been done me in this invitation to speak in memory of Dr. Asghar Ali, engineer. I remember him from many occasions in Delhi when we sat on panels together, and I was always very struck by how his arguments were not only forthright, but in fact very incisive, and his commitment to the, I might almost say, the cause of secularism. In fact, it was such a deep commitment that he had in favor of secularizing Indian society. My talk this evening is really more in the nature of giving you a kind of background context to the issue of secularism. And I'm extremely grateful that Dr. Banaji made the remarks that he made, which were extremely pertinent to where we are at the moment, and why this issue is not just historically and theoretically important, but it is imminently important. Nevertheless, I am going to take up my prerogative as a historian and move back a little bit in time, where I would like you to keep in mind that the implications of what I'm saying are pertinent to our very time at this moment, but I am not going to be referring to the events of the here and now. In speaking about Indian society and the secular, let me say at the outset that secularism goes beyond just politics, although our political parties have attempted to reduce it to a political slogan. So some parties endorse it in theory, but hesitate to apply it properly in practice. Others make fun of it, since their foundational ideology is clearly anti-secular. Supporting secularism or dismissing it is not just a political slogan. It is deeply tied to the question of the kind of society that we want. And this is a question which, alas, we are not asking sufficiently. This is perhaps why it was widely discussed in the early years of independence. I remember the 60s when we all went around talking about what kind of society we were going to build. Whereas now attempts are being made to scuttle secularism and democracy. Questioning the secular would mean seriously changing the direction that we have intended to give to Indian society. If secularism is removed from the constitution, as some people are suggesting, then democracy itself becomes a victim. And this I feel very strongly about, and therefore would like to give a little attention to. Please keep it in the back of your mind whilst I'm talking about secularism. If, however, we want a secular society, then we would have to cease identifying ourselves primarily by religion or caste or language, and start thinking of ourselves primarily as equal citizens of one nation, both in theory and in practice. This involves mutual obligations between the state and the citizens, and between citizens, not just in theory, as of now, but in actuality and the practice of daily politics. The relationship of other identities, such as religion, caste, language, region, whatever, will inevitably have to become secondary. These latter have to be adjusted so as to ensure that rights of citizenship together with what they entail, remain primary. Eventually, the state will not be expected to support any religious organization, even those that it is currently supporting. I would like to begin, therefore, by trying to explain what at least I mean by the terms secular, secularism, and secularizing, since I shall be using these terms, and also since I think that we really don't pay enough attention to trying to understand precisely what we mean by them. Secular, therefore, is that which relates to the world and is distinct from the religious. Secularism involves questioning the control that religious organizations, or to use Jairus' phrase, religious entrepreneurs, have over social institutions. This is thought to be justified by arguing that it ensures morality. But the morality fundamental to secularism goes beyond any single religion and extends to the functioning of the entire society. Secularism does not deny the presence of religion in society, but demarcates the social institutions over which religion can or cannot exercise control. This distinction is absolutely fundamental. And finally, secularizing is the process by which society changes and recognizes the distinction. When the term secular first was used in 1851, secular had one basic meaning. It described laws relating to morals and social values as having been created by human society in order to ensure the well-being and harmonious functioning of that society. These laws were neither the creation of any divine authority, nor did they require the sanction of divine authority as had been held by various religious organizations. Authority, according to the secular, lay in working out through reasoning and sensitivity what was best for society in keeping with generally accepted values of tolerance and social responsibility by those that constituted that society. Authority, therefore, was exercised through laws, and social values grew out of rational thinking, debate, and discussion. This was needed to establish a moral code agreed to by the entire society and was not linked to any particular religion, caste, or class. What this means is that the laws and social values that govern the society are observed as laws in themselves, sanctioned and upheld by a secular authority distinct from religion or caste. Religion involving belief in faith continues to exist, but does not determine civil laws. Secularism, therefore, is not a denial of religion, but it is a curtailment of the control that religious organizations have over civil laws and over social functioning, both of which are extremely important. And this is the generally accepted definition. This definition made people think about the purpose of their laws, and one didn't just dismiss them by saying they're God-given or they're given by a religious authority. And thinking about the purpose of laws is always extremely very useful. So as we all know, the observance of the law is strengthened when people understand its purpose. Having to reason things out meant that people had to learn to think independently. This thinking came from their education. Here too, the simple explanation of everything being part of a divine plan and requiring divine sanction was certainly attractive, but not always the answer. In fact, seldom so. Therefore, education began to involve searching for explanations other than those based on faith and religion. But preferably, social laws began to be drawn from rational inquiry into both the natural and the human world in which we live. Occasionally, there might even have been a small leap of imagination, ultimately to be explained by reason. The explanations for the laws and a discussion of these became an essential part of education and of thinking about the implications of being secularized. And this is an important aspect of the process of secularization, thinking about the implications. Religion had originated as a personal and emotional need. This was then extended to explain how one experienced life, and beyond that, how the universe functioned. This was all attributed to a supernatural power who was held in awe. Gradually, however, this personalized religion became a complex, organized religion and took the form of institutions ambitious to control both society and politics, which they frequently succeeded in doing. With this change, religion became powerful both as the focus of belief and as an authority controlling social institutions through various religious organizations. In some places, its power paralleled that of the governing authority, the state. It is this particular aspect of religion, namely the control that religious organizations have over social institutions, that the secular person wishes to keep separate from the actions of the state. The distinction is important because we often overlook it in saying that secularism denies religion altogether. Keeping this in mind, secularism then takes an additional meaning. The state having authority over the making and observing of laws by human agencies should be distinct from religion, since religion has its sanction from faith and from deity. The authority of each is clearly different and should not be confused. Social laws are the spine of a society. They should protect the right to live, and they should ensure that there should be no discrimination that affects life and work. This is crucial to protecting the points of change in the human life cycle for which laws are necessary. And what are these points of change? They're registering birth, marriage, or even divorce, processes of education by which a child is socialized into society, occupation and employment, and inheritance, generally of property. Actions linked to these come under the jurisdiction of civil law. To make this link effective, social laws should ensure the absolute minimum. And these would be equal access to education, to healthcare for all members of society, and to employment. And this is to be irrespective of religion or caste or any other feature of discrimination. If civil laws are to be universal and uniform, as they would be ultimately in a secular society, then we must ensure this endorsement by the state. So, religious authority continues in a secular system, but its control over society is curtailed. It extends to governing religious beliefs and practice. It has been argued that there should be no rigid barrier between religion and the state, but there can be a negotiated, principled distance between them. This allows for new alignments within and between the religions, or between religion and the state. It disallows the dominance of any single religion, since each would have equal rights on the state and the state on them. Nevertheless, a degree of separation would be agreed to inasmuch as religious authority would no longer be controlling civil laws. What I have described so far as in general terms as to what secularism means is not, of course, the same as what is sometimes described as the Indian definition of secularism, namely the coexistence of all religions. But coexistence alone is insufficient, as religions can be treated as unequal and some can be marginalized, as we know only too well today. The acceptance of coexistence together with equal status before the law can certainly be a first step, but we do have to ask how far does it go and what should be the next step. This definition, based on the coexistence of religions, is incomplete in many ways, since the question of the jurisdiction of religious authority over society remains unanswered. The intention would in any case be not to put up barriers between state and religion, it would be to demarcate the activities that come under a civil jurisdiction, and those that would continue to be controlled by the organizations representing religious authority. In a democratic system, the equality would be essential as spelling out who controls the laws. In contemporary India, the coexistence of religions exists in theory, but their equality has yet to be established. The secular is less evident, and some might even say that it is virtually absent. Political and state patronage does not invariably distance itself from religious organizations. In fact, it is sometimes closely tied together, as we indeed know. Some oppose secularism by arguing that it is a Western concept not suited to India. Should the same be said about concepts like nationhood, democracy, both new to post-independence India? And surely our internalizing today of the new liberal market economy is a far stronger imprint of Westernization. To support the secularizing of society does not mean subordinating ourselves to a Western concept, but rather trying to understand a process of change in our contemporary history. Being a nation-state is a new experience in modern times and is current now in every part of the world. We have chosen democracy as the most feasible system despite its being new to us. I would argue that a secular society is essential to democratic functioning. Let me turn now to the specifically Indian aspect of the subject. To begin with, we need to explore the question of how we have understood the role of religion in our society. My argument is that colonial scholarship, British and European, introduced a disjuncture in our understanding of our past. It changed it from the way in which we traditionally understood the past. Any deliberate social change with sizable consequence becomes a little easier to handle if one can see its earlier historical forms and their gradual mutation. The present, after all, it does emerge out of the past. And in understanding the relationship between society and religion, We have been nurtured on ideas that came from colonial views of Indian religion. We have internalized these views without adequately questioning them. So, a brief re-examination of these might be helpful. Colonial perceptions were based on the European experience of religion in the context of European society. With reference to Europe, secularism is often described as the separation between church and state. This is taken as a one-to-one relationship, because generally the religion was a single, monolithic religion. This was so strongly asserted that in medieval times those that questioned the writ of religion in Europe were heavily punished as heretics. Some were burnt, some had to recant, as did Galileo, and many faced the punitive actions of the Inquisition. The Enlightenment then came as a reaction to this, and from new knowledge that encouraged questioning and emphasized rational explanation. The conservative perspective of religion from the past that was familiar to British colonizers of India was this perspective. They read the history of Indian religion through this perspective. But more recent writing on the subject, and by more recent writing I mean the last 40 years or so, 30 or 40 years, suggests that this was a defective view and needs re-investigation. The colonial image of Indian society projected two nations, the Hindu and the Muslim, defined by monolithic religious identities and inherently said to be hostile to each other. And because of their mutual hostility, a controlling authority from outside was required. And this became one of the justifications for colonial rule. As many historians have pointed out, this image was then imprinted on the history of India, especially on the medieval period, thus enforcing a distancing between the two religions. To add to this, colonial policy implanted the idea of the majority and minority communities identified by religion, and arrived at through the census of British India, first held in 1872. This further consolidated the idea of monolithic religions, and these in turn fueled communal politics. Permanent majority and minority communities are, of course, contrary to the norms of democracy, as was mentioned by Jairus earlier. A democratic majority consists of those in the largest number who join in support of a particular policy. Those that join are not qualified to do so by affiliation to any previous organization. Forming a majority, therefore, is not based on any pre-existing caste or linguistic identities or religious identities. The constituents of the majority change with each issue. There are no permanent members of majority or minority communities in a democracy that functions democratically. Anti-colonial nationalism tried to confront this image, since broad-based nationalism has to be inclusive. It has to induct a range of opinion and also has to draw on a shared history. I will be referring to a shared history again because this is a very important concept. The shared history is crucial. I would also like to quote Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote that history plays the same role in nationalism as does the poppy in the life of the opium addict. It is the source. It feeds ideas of identity. Anti-colonial nationalism did not question the monolithic nature of religious communities. It focused instead on denying their antagonism and projecting their coexistence, which it does still to these days in the concept of secularism. This became central to its idea of secularism, but this did not fully succeed. One reason was that the colonial view of religion in India was, and it still is, foundational to the ideologies of what are now referred to as religious nationalisms, Hindu and Muslim, that went into the making of the communal landscape of India. And religious nationalisms are, of course, different from the main anti-colonial nationalism. In other words, I am arguing that anti-colonial nationalism, as well as religious nationalisms, both accepted and built on the colonial construction of Indian religion. However, anti-colonial nationalism did occasionally question this construction, but the religious nationalisms, both Hindu and Muslim, made it foundational to their ideologies. A century or so ago, the main organizations propagating religious nationalisms were the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha. These were not religious orthodoxies. They were rather ideologies using religion for political mobilization. Today, religious nationalisms include a range of Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, and other religious organizations, politically ambitious and anxious to retain control over community laws, to ensure a political constituency. Religious nationalisms dispute a shared history, since their history has to be divisive and confrontational. The struggle over history textbooks of recent decades, therefore, is the attempt to project a history slanted towards one religion and the denial of a shared history. We may well ask, was this actually the way in which religion functioned in relation to Indian society from early times? Have we really looked analytically at our past? Have we examined the role of religious organizations from that past? What form did these organizations take? How did they exert authority? And which sections of society supported which organization? I can only suggest a few answers to these questions. We all know that the historical picture of religions in India was complex. It was not just a simple binary of two monolithic religions, the Hindu and the Muslim. Religious teaching and identities were determined by an array of sects, some of which were localized and linked to castes. These were not large monolithic communities. There was a link between the religious sect and the caste, and this in turn had connections with state authority. I'm arguing, therefore, that it was a three-way process involving the religious sect, the social caste, and the state. There was no church to bring together all the sects into a single entity. In other words, I'm also arguing for a much more decentralized and localized way of looking at religion in its history and even in contemporary times. And this is beginning to happen in recent historical studies of religion. In the Indian past, the crucial relationship lay in the connection between multiple religious sects and many castes. The sect propagated belief, the caste often determined its social context. Status was measured through an interdependence of both. Upper castes across religion tended to be more closely associated with the text-based formal manifestations of the religion, whereas the lower castes, perhaps being less text-based, were far more flexible. And this is one reason why I think that we really need to study the religion of the lower castes in history much more closely than we have done, much more extensively, because that is really where the essence of the religions of India lie. Caste determined the social code, maintained formally by those who claimed familiarity with the texts. For most people, however, it was the hearsay of tradition. The authority of the codes of caste and sect over society should now be replaced by civil law applicable to all and protecting secularity and social justice. Many valuable and meticulous studies have been made of religious texts that have enhanced our understanding of the religions. However, less attention has been given to examining the institutions created by various religions, both to propagate their beliefs and as agencies of social control. Rather than focusing on monolithic, undifferentiated religious society in general, what would be much more insightful is if we would study the link between caste and sect in order to comprehend more precisely the interface, the actual interface between religion and society in our past. The link between caste and sect had a flexibility, even a fluidity, that monolithic religions lack. We could then ask whether the rigidity lay less in religion and more in caste determination. I'm always struck by one example, that every religion in India segregates and discriminates against those in the same religion who are regarded as Dalits, even the religions that claim that all men are equal in the eyes of God. Even in those religions, the Dalits are segregated and discriminated against. The colonial construction of religion in India therefore requires re-examination. Perhaps we need to look more carefully at how caste in past times, and now additionally class in its turn, has shaped and is shaping relations between religious institutions and society, or which groups in society support which political religious organizations and why. In pre-Islamic times, there is no reference to monolithic religions as, for example, to either Hinduism or Buddhism as such. Instead, there is reference to two broad categories of sects that propagated distinctive ideas. These were called Brahmana and Shramana. The Brahmanas believed in the gods, in the divine sanction of the Vedas, and in the immortality of the soul. The Shramana sects, on the other hand, referring largely to Buddhists and Jains and so on, denied all this and were therefore called the Nastikas, the non-believers. But within each of these two categories, there were distinct sects of various beliefs that were recognized. Neither of these was the Brahmana or the Shramana. Neither of these was monolithic. Each had diverse sects. Their duality is mentioned repeatedly in references to what we would today call religion. And I'm really rather surprised that all of us as historians didn't recognize this earlier. This duality continues over a period of 1500 years, from the edicts of Ashoka, who refers to Brahmanam Samanam, to the accounts of Megasthenes, who refers to Brahmanes and Sarmanes, to the Chinese Buddhist pilgrims, who refers to the Deos and the non-Deos, and Al-Biruni in the 11th century, who also refers to Brahmans and Samaniyas. References are made in Brahmanical texts such as the Vishnu Puran and in Buddhist texts to occasional hostilities between these two groups. And interestingly, they each use the same abusive term for each other. Each one calls the other Pashanda, which means a fraud. The grammarian of Sanskrit, Patanjali, of the early centuries AD, refers to these two groups, the Brahmins and the Shamanas, and adds that their relationship was comparable to that of the snake and the mongoose. Those not included in these two streams were, of course, the people of the extremely low status, the Dalits, the lower castes, the tribal people. They had their own belief systems and forms of worship, and among the multiple sects that were emerging over time, some adhered to the orthodox and others were supporters of the heterodox. The advantage of sects over monolithic religions is that sects shade off from the very orthodox to those less so, and therefore this allows the less orthodox to assimilate new beliefs, and these are not treated as heresy. The heretics function as a separate category. And therefore there is this fluidity that I was talking about. You don't have confrontational monolithic religions. The creation of a sect was open and common and led to religious plurality, characteristic of every religion in India. This is crucial to understanding the relationship between religion and societies. These relationships differed from society to society in every part of the world. The pattern of religion and society in Europe cannot be automatically imposed on India. This does not imply that the meaning of secularism can change, but that the manner in which it is introduced into a society may vary from one to the other. The Shramana category took a fairly linear form with an original teaching from which segments branched off. The history of Brahmanism is much more complex. An early phase was Vedic Brahmanism, focusing on the sacrificial ritual, the yajna performed by upper castes, invoking deities like Indra and Agni. The heterodox sects, preeminently the Buddhists, the Jains and the Ajivakas, questioned these beliefs. And the heterodox groups tended, because they didn't accept the existence of gods and divine sanction, they tended to provide rational explanations about social institutions. They established a critical tradition of questioning orthodoxy, although eventually they established their own orthodoxies. By the early centuries AD, Brahmanical ritual became more individualized, with a focus on the worship of new gods, Shiva and Vishnu. Sects associated with this worship were often differentiated, as for example, the Vaishnava Bhagavat and the Shaiva Pashupat. From the 7th century, religious belief and worship took the form of what we call bhakti worship, devotional sects. They arose at various times in different parts of the subcontinent, teaching different kinds of doctrines, and many of them, in fact, confronting orthodoxy. With the arrival of Islam, and more so with the presence of a particular category of Islamic sects known as the Sufis, the exploration of religious ideas, both orthodox and heterodox, expanded inevitably. New sects came in and created newer sects. And so did the number of sects. Some took orthodox positions, others held out mixed beliefs and worship. The ones that held out mixed beliefs and worship were the ones that were much more common with the larger, more popular with the larger number of people. As in earlier times, the sect remained the popular religious identity amongst the majority of people. This becomes more evident if we look at two processes, for example, in the coming of Islam: settlement and conversion. Today, this event, the coming of Islam, is projected at the popular level largely only in terms of invasion and the subsequent political consequences. But there were many other avenues, equally important, if not more so, that took different forms and in the settlements and are seen in the settlements of traders, migrants, Sufis, administrators, and such like. Muhammad bin Qasim's conquest of Sindh is very well known, but far more interesting to history were the settlements of Arab traders all down the west coast of India from Sindh to Kerala. Some Arabs actually entered the service of the Rashtrakuta kings of the Deccan, dating to the 9th century. The more senior among them exercised their right as high-status officers to give grants of land to temples and to Brahmins, as had been the prevailing custom in the Rashtrakuta administration. Arab traders intermarried locally and new communities evolved with a new take on existing religions. Inevitably, these became not new religions, but new sects, such as the Bohras, the Khojas, the Navayat, the Mapila, and in other places the Meos, and many others, where belief, ritual, and civil law did not hesitate to draw from the texts, but also, and sometimes to a great extent, from existing local practices. So no two of these sects were identical. The Gujarati Bohras had very little to do with the Malayali Mapilas. Many such sects mushroomed all over, and they're only just beginning to be studied as part of social and religious history. The earlier pattern of sects continued into later centuries. The new teachers of various persuasions, as in earlier times, attracted followers, and the popularity of the sects often determined religious belief and faith. Until recently, it was through the membership of a sect that many Indians, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, everybody, experienced religion. Identity with the formal religion was more characteristic amongst only the upper castes and perhaps those of earlier generations under colonial periods. This was prior to the current ingress, of course, of Hindutva and Islamization that have considerably hardened the boundaries between religions these days. Many people, even today, who identify themselves with a monolithic religion, whichever it may be, when they are pressed further, will mention the sect that they belong to, or at least the holy man whom they revere, the Baba, the Guru, the Sant, and so on, and who can be of any persuasion whatsoever. This link is often more pertinent to the lives that they actually live. What is interesting is that the sects that most people identify with today are generally those that trace themselves back to the last 1,000 years. So let's just look briefly at what was happening to some religions in the last 1,000 years. In the history of India, a medieval history, which colonial historians called the Muslim period, is located in the last 1,000 years. This history has had a raw deal from religious extremists and politicians in being described as the age when, to quote the familiar phrase, we were slaves for 1,000 years. The assumption being that Islamic rule tyrannized and oppressed the Hindu population. This opinion is a direct continuation of the British interpretation of Indian history and religion. Viewed historically, the scene differs enormously. The interaction between what we call Hinduism and Islam did have its moments of confrontation and conflict in the face-offs between competing politics. Some confrontations were to be expected. These were manifested in various ways. What were often political acts at that time are often interpreted today as entirely motivated by religion, with the politics left out. This is a misreading of many events. However, religious confrontations were not new on the Indian scene. We have to remember that. It was not only that they came with the coming of Islam. They go back to pre-Islamic times, as we know. Patanjali was probably correct in his comparison of Brahmins and Shramans to the snake and the mongoose and the cat and the dog. Other Sanskrit texts and inscriptions do refer to the killing of Buddhist and Jain monks. Indian culture, we must remember, was neither given to permanent religious aggression, as colonial scholars maintained, nor was it entirely free of such aggression, as we have sometimes maintained amongst nationalist thinking. It was, in fact, a very normal culture, similar to many others in the world at that time, and it had its share of normal confrontations. The striking creativity that enriched aspects of earlier Indian culture continued in the medieval period. We live with many of these cultural forms to this day. The intellectual liveliness of the time expressed in Sanskrit and Persian texts matched that of earlier times, although the genres of expression were sometimes different. It was precisely this period that gave shape and form in various ways to much, although not all, that we now identify as Hindu in the landscape of present times. Leaving aside for the moment the interaction of cultures practicing diverse religions, some of the activities clustered around even the Brahmanical tradition are most impressive. Throughout the second millennium AD, that is in the last 1,000 years, from Kashmir to Kerala and in between, there were new scholarly commentaries in Sanskrit being composed on Brahmanical texts and religious practices which were widely discussed. Sayana's much-quoted explanation of the Rig Veda is a fascinating glimpse into the mind of a learned scholar of the 14th century, with its mix of reality and fantasy. Social change draws out new commentaries on existing social codes. Kuluka's commentary on the Manudharma Shastra incorporates a reaction to the social change of the times. For example, he discusses, for the first time in the social codes, the debate over the status of the temple priest vis-à-vis other categories of priests like the Kshatriya Brahmana. This became a matter of concern only when the temple grew in size and power, and as frequently happened in the last 1,000 years. The looting of some of the wealthy temples did not prevent the building of other equally wealthy ones. There were many commentaries, digests, discussions on philosophy, on classical Sanskrit poetry, on literary compositions. Philosophical theories are discussed in texts commonly read in the middle of the second millennium AD, such as the Sarva Darshana Sangraha in the 14th century. There were theoretical explorations, for example, in mathematics and astronomy, with ideas traveling from Ujjain to Baghdad to Samarkand and beyond, with new texts composed at the cutting edge of knowledge, studied with care by Central Asian scholars and Arab scholars. Classical Hindustani music and Carnatic music took its present form and was patronized by the courts of sultans, nawabs, maharajas, and mughals. In addition to Sanskrit and Persian, literary compositions of high quality came to be composed in the regional languages, reflecting a new dimension of thought much of it coming from non-elite sources. These acquired new standing in the royal courts and in places linked to religious sects. And such compositions, let's not forget, carried much of the thought and creativity of their own times, as is evident, for instance, in the Ramacharitmanas in Hindi and the Kritivasa in Bengali, much revered and read by Hindi and Bengali speakers at the time when they were composed 500, 300 years ago. Many alternate narratives, sung as epics and ballads by folk poets and bards, provided a perspective of local heroes different from those of the ruling court. These were the voices of numbers of people. These voices sang the bhajans of Meera and Surdas and the compositions of Tyagaraja, and repeated the dohas of Ras Khan on Krishna Bhakti. We today seem unable to look beyond what we have been told by those that colonized us and those who loyally continue to carry on with that colonial legacy in their understanding of religion and culture. But do remember that these voices that I have been speaking of were not voices of enslaved people. In this rather scattered attempt to look at some aspects of the past, I've tried to underline the plurality in the articulation of religion in India, often in the form of sects with their interface with castes. To disengage religious institutions from controlling the functions of civil society would help us in bringing about a more equitable society. The stratification endorsed by religion would no longer hold. The powers of control of another agency in addition to the state, namely religion, would also be decreased. The process of secularizing society will have to address both religion and caste, and to that extent it requires a different kind of analysis than that made of religions elsewhere in the world. We shall have to re-examine the colonial version of the interface between our religions and our society. And we are experiencing today the colonial aftermath of the stridency of some organizations that claim a mixed political and religious authority, but have become actually mechanisms for political mobilization. Secularization, therefore, will have to be thought through with sensitivity and thoroughness. And although it cannot be a rapid change, nevertheless, a serious beginning has to be made to include secular values through establishing confidence in a secular society and explaining its necessary link to democracy. I would like to suggest that a beginning could be made in two possible ways. One would be to ensure the secular in education, and the other, the secular in civil laws. Education means the availability of all branches of knowledge to all citizens without discrimination. Knowledge means updated information and training young people to endorse the methods of critical inquiry. I would like to add to this that there is a need for young people to know what is meant by a shared history. Our civil laws were drawn up in colonial times, although we have made some changes after independence. In a turn to the secular, we shall have to comb through the existing civil laws to ensure that they conform to equal rights for all citizens with no exceptions. Resolving the differences between civil laws and the laws of each religion and caste will have to be discussed with the communities concerned and not limited just to those controlling religious and caste codes. A uniform civil code does not mean merely doing away with the personal laws of any single religious code. It means reconsidering jointly the civil laws of all religious codes and caste codes, and arriving at a common secular civil code. In this process, injustice and discrimination against minorities and against the underprivileged, whether because of religion, gender or caste, will need to be annulled, as also the religious and caste privileges that may be claimed as traditional rights. Law does not remain law if it can be manipulated to allow discrepancies. And this is likely to be the most problematic in our turn towards secularizing society. The overwhelming projection of religiosity, by which I mean not religion, but its excessive display on all occasions, as has become the norm these days, sometimes appears to be a surrogate for not coming to terms with real-life problems. Or perhaps it reflects our having become a highly competitive society with accompanying insecurities. Insecurity leads to clutching at what is the most easily available, which frequently is politicized religion. Can we instead consider how we can make the reality of citizenship a guarantee of our social welfare, our well-being, our understanding of the world, and our wish to bring quality into our lives? The secularizing of society is not an overnight revolution. It is a historical process and will need time. But hopefully, it will be assisted by the recognition that the state and society need to function in new ways. Implicit in democracy is the upholding of the ethic of human action, and secularizing society is an advancing of that very ethic. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Romila Thappar, for really delivering an excellent lecture. Really a very educative, informative, and excellent lecture about our past, about understanding our present time. Now the floor is open for a few question and answers. I would request on behalf of Professor Romila Thappar that do not ask questions on present political situation, but on the lecture.